Now, I am not going to share my screen for the first bit of the lesson because I would like to run through the exam paper to give you an inkling of what you will be expecting. I guess that you will like this part of the lecture for one simple reason, because it's going to facilitate the day the exam comes. Okay? So obviously I'm not going to show you what's in the paper, but I'm going to give you good explanation of what I'll be expecting, like bit by bit. I will dissect the exam paper into the relevant sections and give you an explanation of each and every section as we go along. The paper is divided into two. I still need to see if it's 2 hours or 1.5, because usually it's 1.5 hours. But I noticed that in the timetable, it has been timetabled as 2 hours, so that is something that I need to check. But that is not really concern, because the least time you will get will be 1.5. So there's a possibility that that might be extended to 2 hours, which obviously would be even more advantageous. I do not think that there is 2 hours work in one. Are you all hearing me, guys? Because I don't want to be talking alone.
Yes, yes.
Brilliant.
Yes, it's clear.
Excellent. Actually, you know what? Actually, I'm not going to start now for the simple reason that Gavin is not with us. Let's just wait for Gavin to enter the classroom, and then I'll discuss what needs to be discussed once Gavin is here, because so that obviously is not at a disadvantage. I'm assuming that you agree.
Yes, actually, it would be fair for him. So
Exactly. Okay. Mela, let me share my screen. Okay, I'm supposed to be live. Please tell me if you can see my screen, because yesterday we had some trouble with Discord. This is
Yes,
the
it's working.
Brilliant, thank you. Now let's go into the relevant PowerPoint, which is this one. We had started comics, and we had discussed the first few sections. We were talking about the birth of the comic book, and we spoke about the famous funnies, basically that the comic book had attained some popularity, and that popularity was only increasing with time. And because of that popularity, we arrived at a stage in the history of comics where comics were even adopted to the silver screen. Technically speaking, this showed the potential of comics, the fact that comic storytelling was of such a caliber that it could actually be translated into good evening, Gavin. Pleased to have you on board. I just started the lecture. Soon I will be switching to giving a brief explanation of what to expect in the exam paper. Are you hearing me well and loud and clear, Gavin?
Yes, I am.
Super.
Okay. All right. Sorry for being late.
Not a problem at all. As I was saying, this proved that the comic was not simply something that was being produced for young children. It was not something that could be lightly discarded, but it was something that was evocative of true storytelling, extremely visual storytelling, and it actually provided a very stable launching pad for other platforms, in transmedia storytelling. So basically, a comic was something that could be easily, in inverted commas, transposed into a series or a movie, and so on and so forth. And we had also asked the question, sort of, what does this remind us of? And I remember a couple of you saying that it reminded us of Star Wars, which was very much in the same period. Actually, the first Star Wars was in 1977. So basically, this came slightly after Star Wars. So we can see the effect of Star Wars. We can see easily a Han Solo over here. We can easily see a Princess Leia over here. We can easily see a C-3PO over there. Okay, am I right? This is where we left off, roughly, right?
Yes.
Yes, brilliant. So that takes us to the next slide, where we're going to discuss pulps. What are pulps? Well, basically, pulps were 10-cent comic books, which really and truly brought about the actual launching of comic books as something which could be easily bought from the newsstand. It was colorful, albeit basically colorful. It had the basic colors of yellow and red and blue and black, which were the usual printing colors. It had the advent of action heroes. Here we see Phantom as the action hero. The action hero was relatively a new invention in this period of time. The action hero was the bigger than life individual, usually a male rather than a female. We must remember that we are in a time where gender equality was not an issue, and we also need to remember that comics are very much a reflection of the current cultural and social situation in whatever area we are, because obviously comics took different aspects when it comes to the region. So we have European comics, American comics, and namely Far East comics. That is where the three main branches of comics appeared. We also said that 10 cents was relatively a decent sum of money. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't very expensive either. And a book could be easily lent from one person to another, so it did have quite a wide reach. And it would literally go from one grubby hand to another grubby hand. It could be read by the whole street or the whole area in town. So obviously we see this promulgation of the comic and this interest which is being built up. Here we have a sample of the Phantom. Notice that it is very basic in terms of structure, very basic in terms of dialogue, very basic in terms of coloring and drawing, but obviously it transported the people of the day into into countries which they knew they would never visit, into times and eras which they knew that they would never visit. So these type of comics could either take you into the past or take you into the unimaginable rather future. And obviously this was one of the only media which could actually do this, because it was a time where television was at its most basic, where film was barely existent, where other forms of media were extremely nondescript. So obviously this type of visual media was very rampant because it was easy to produce. One could evoke a lot, as an enormous sense of imagination. And there was absolutely no limitation as to the imagination involved. Before we go on to Marvel and DC and the origins of Marvel and DC, I would like to switch to the exam paper so that we get it over and done with. Okay, so I'm going to shut off my screen share. So do I have you all with me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the exam paper is divided into two sections. There are 3 questions in section A, with 2 questions in section B, and both sections should be answered in their totality, in their entirety. All right, so both all 3 questions in section A and all 2 questions in section B have to be answered. So you basically answer all the questions that are given there. There is no choice.
Okay.
The first question presents 3 images. You'll be seeing 3 images. Now, please remember that you will be sitting for the exam. If I'm not mistaken, your exam is in person, right? Am I correct?
Yes, we'll have to come to university.
Exactly. So in this case, what will happen is that the exam paper obviously will not be in color, but I do not think that will detract that much from the quality. Okay, I don't think that it will detract that much from the quality. So you have 3 images of 3 works of art, 3 specific works of art that we have not discussed in class. And yet I would like you to use the discussion that we had in class to be able to analyze each and every work individually. So obviously you need to adapt your discussion to each and every work. The works don't necessarily need to be paintings, so you have works in different media, very different media. You will realize what I'm saying when you see them. Obviously, they are a surprise. You do have some information as regards to each work. You have the artist, for example, the date that it was created, the period and style of the artwork, the medium that was used for the creation of the artwork, the dimensions of the artwork, and the location of the artwork. So that will give you a bit of an idea about the history of the artwork. And the question asks you if these particular works can be defined as art or not. You are free to tell me yes or no. I will not be offended if you say absolutely not. This artwork is shite. Well, you don't necessarily need to write shite, but you need obviously to give me an explanation why you believe this work cannot be considered as a work of art, as art, in reality, as art. And remember that our main discussion when it comes to art was that art evokes argumentation. Art evokes conversation. Right? The presence of art itself, the actual existence of art, is a way of how dialogue can be created between the artist and the viewer, and between viewer and viewer. Right? So the art is the creation of a question marks, a discussion of the reason why that artwork has been created and produced. So these are roughly the ideas that I would like you to discuss with regards to each and every artwork that is presented. And just excuse me a bit. Brilliant. So that's the first question in section A. Any queries with regards to this question, please? Anything you'd like to clarify?
No, sounds clear.
It sounds clear. Very good. Anyone else?
Same, it's clear.
Okay. Feel free to ask me anything you need. Remember, this is the moment where you can clarify issues. Whatever. No, not with regards to the elements. That's another question. You just need to give me a subjective opinion, your own opinion, that is, on if you believe that this art, that this work can be considered art or not. So you do not need to include any other theoretic elements within this question. Make sense, Alex? Brilliant. Anyone else, please? Let's move to the second question. In the second question, we're going to tackle the second part of the first PowerPoint that we did. And we're going to be discussing the elements. There are 7 elements in all. You are being asked for 4 of those elements. You need to, the first part of the question, you need to tell me, in writing obviously, how you use these 4 elements that you chose from the 7. And why you use these elements in your project. Okay, so that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question, you need to give an example, one example for each element from any genre that you like. It could be a film, it could be a game, it could be anything. Okay. I am checking the paper at the same time just in case to check that there are no mistakes or anything. So let me repeat what's in the second question. You are asked to list 4 elements and explain how you use them in your project and why you use them in your project. So obviously you're going to choose the 4 that you used in your project. So it could be line, it could be color, it could be light. Then you're going to give an example from a film or a game which made use of these elements. So I need an example for each element. And you can give me an idea of why you think that film or game or whatever, sort of how they made use of that particular element. For example, the use of perspective in a film or a game. The use of color in a film or a game. The use of line. Okay, so we can find one example for each. That's question 2. Any queries with regards to question 2?
No, it's all good.
Very good. Anyone else? Okay, brilliant. Let's go to the third question in section A, which is the last question in section A. The third question is about sight and vision, which is the third part of the PowerPoint presentation, the first PowerPoint, the third topic. There is a bit of an introduction with regards to sight and vision, and then you are asked to name and explain 3 vision cues. So you don't just name them, but you also explain what they are. You give a brief explanation. When I say brief explanation, usually it's about 3 to 5 lines maximum. If there are any diagrams involved, and some of them do have diagrams with regards to the structure of the eye or how light enters the eye and so on and so forth, I do require a simplified diagram to be drawn. Again, it's a simplified diagram, so you don't need to go into any absolute detail. The eye can be, for example, just a circle and then just a couple of lines, but it's very important that you label the diagram adequately. Diagrams need to be neatly done, And please do not insert diagrams in the side of the page, but allocate enough space for the diagram to be as clear as possible and as readable as possible. The diagram is there to obviously enlarge on your explanation. The second part of question 3 had a typo over there. The second part of question 3, you need to explain how you took these attributes while creating your storyboard for your assignment. These three vision cues that you have chosen, how were they used in your assignment? Was there any particular use for them? Why? How did they increase the effectiveness of your assignment? So technically speaking, what I'm saying is that you need to have a look at your assignment, your storyboard, and try to find out ways and means how these vision cues could have actually have relevance. And you can prepare yourself like that. And you give me a brief explanation, a very brief explanation. Technically speaking, in question 3, the first part carries 6 marks. So that's 2 marks each for each vision cue that is named and explained. The second part, the explain how they have been involved in your assignment, carries 9 marks, so that's 3 marks each for each explanation. Any question with regards to these questions, please?
Now it's clear. Thank you.
Extremely good.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you. Very good. The next question is in section B. In section B, excuse me. In section B, we have 2 questions. The first question is a topic that we still need to do. That is character design. The question asks you why does character design exist, and how can character design be applied to user interfaces and user experience and game design. So user interface design, user experience design, and game design. That is something that we'll be doing next session. That's question 1 in section B. It carries 20 marks. So you need to compare and contrast. Rather, you need to explain.
20 marks. That's like an essay then, a little essay.
Yes, I expect around, let's say around, not an essay per se, because I would expect not more than 100 words. Not more than 100 words. So it's a brief paragraph. Makes sense, Bridget?
Yes, thank you.
Very good. So about 100 words, because in fact, the next question, which carries 30 marks, you're going to be given 3 comic strips, 3 sequential art strips, coming from 3 very different types of comics. So they will be given to you. Remember that they're going to be seen in black and white, albeit the fact that not all of them are in black and white. In fact, you have 2 in black and white, which are actual black and white, and one of them is not black and white. And you will immediately notice which is not supposed to be black and white and which is supposed to be black and white. Now, I do not want you to know what is the comic technically, but I need you to compare and contrast the 3 strips. All right, so you're going to write between between 100 to 150 words. In this question, between 100 and 250 words in each question. So between 50 to 100 words per strip. And you're going to analyze each strip with regards to style and techniques. So that's the first part of the question. You're going to analyze each comic strip with regards to style and techniques. And it is a requirement that you name as many elements as possible that we are naming in our PowerPoint presentation. So, for example, you mentioned the use of speech bubbles, the use of the God's voice. You can mention any of the elements that we'll be discussing as we go along. The more elements you mention, obviously, the more marks you gain. And that's a requirement. In fact, it's written there in your analysis. Include as many elements of narrative and sequential art as discussed in class. The second part of this question 2 in section B, you need to give an alternative example for each of those comics. So tell me what other comic is very similar to the comics that I have presented to you in the exam. Now, your question might be right now in your mind, you might be telling me, but if I'm not interested that much in comics, how will I know? We will be doing a series of comic examples at the end of this slideshow, okay? So we'll have multiple examples for you to use. And obviously, you just need to see which ones are similar in context and in style and which are not. And that carries 30 marks. So section A is 50, section B is 50. And that's it, basically. Any questions with regards to the the second question in section B, please?
When we have to give an alternative example, do you mean like we have to say the Phantom, or do you expect something like Pulps?
No, the title of the comic, like the Phantom.
Okay. All right.
A title. For example, if you give in, I don't know, if you give in, let's say you give in Snoopy, all right, one of the samples is Snoopy, then you need to give me a comic which is similar to Snoopy, that is, has a similar style, like a linear style, presentation style, sort of the way it's presented, the way it's printed, and so on and so forth, that, you know, is as similar as possible, that would fall under the same bracket, basically.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. Anyone else? Everything seems clear, guys.
So can you repeat the first question only, as in why does character design exist and how it is used? What's the second?
You will understand this question more once we go over the topic Taiji theory. So, the first question is the topic is character design. Okay, the topic is character design. So we're going to speak mainly about how do you design a character, what are the elements that you need to keep in mind while designing a character. But now I'm asking you, all right, in this question. In character design, so is character design simply for games, or can it be adapted to other purposes?
All right.
How can you use character design in games? How can you use character design in user experience? How can you use character design in user interfaces?
Okay.
Right. Now, when I talk about character design, remember, character design has a dual functionality. It can be the character in the game, which is a representation, a digital representation, usually, of the player. And it can also be, it can also not have a digital representation, but it can mean the user who is expected to use that particular application. So that is why user experience and user interface come into the argument. So if I'm creating an application, what type of person do I expect to use my application? So that also falls within the remit of character design. You're going to try to think about different people, different types of people that will be using your application. And those are going to be the characters. Making sense?
Yes, yes, thank you, sir.
Anyone else, please? Alex, Brigitte, Gavin, Jamie, Maria, Luke. All clear?
Alright.
Super. So I guess that's it. That's the paper. How are you feeling, guys?
If I may add, it sounds interesting.
Okay. All right. Super.
Yes,
That-
it does.
That makes
It's
clear, I
really fun
guess. Right.
compared to the types of exams I'm used to.
So
It
this
is,
would be a bit more, yes, a bit
It's-
more, say, lenient. It's a discursive paper, and although obviously there are some inverted commas theoretic elements, I am 100% sure that compared, as you said yourself, to the other subjects that you are used to, this is going to be way more lenient with regards to the theory, because the theoretic aspects are simply words which are used to define a particular element. So they would be more sort of the jargon that is being used rather than, theory.
yes,
You know?
if it's just the topic, it's, I mean, it's more interesting for me. So maybe that's also a reason why I'm seeing it as exciting.
Yes. No. That's obviously something that gives me more excitement when I know that sort of if you're interested in the paper, that means you're going to do your best. Sort of, it's going to be an interesting experience for me when I'm correcting your paper.
Okay, good.
Looking forward. Thank you. Mela, can you excuse me literally 1 minute because I received a phone call, and let me just get back to the phone call, see if it was an urgent phone call or not. It will literally take me a minute, guys. Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Cheers, thanks. Thank you for that. Appreciate. And moving on. So this brings us to obviously a development in comics. So sort of because there is a demand, automatically, demand creates supply, and we start having more experimentation, and we start getting the first idea of the Marvel tales, and this is the initiation of Marvel as we know them today. Marvel vis-a-vis DC. So we have Marvel literally coming in as a reply for DC Comics. So the fact that DC Entertainment was making a lot of noise in the 30s, Martin Goodman started creating all these characters and started including them in what he called the Marvel tales. So basically, Martin Goodman was seen as the founding father of Marvel as we know it today. Obviously, after Martin Goodman, we see the advent of the likes of Stan Lee, God rest his soul, and so on and so forth. These comics, termed as the fortnightly pulps, first of all, gave us the ability to be able to produce comics faster. In fact, we see these colorful covers, but in the inside would be a bit more raw in printing. Even the paper would be quite cheap paper, quite thin and rough. But remember that they were not intent on the quality of the comics as we might see today. Today we have box sets with beautiful presentation, but in those days it was simply creating as much reading material as possible and as could assuage the contemporary demand. They were called 4-color pulps for the simple reason that they contain the 4 main colors in printing, which is blue, yellow, red, and black. And the white would obviously be the white of the paper itself. And because those were the 4 available colors in contemporary printing, those were the colors that were used to create these particular comics. So the competition for Marvel was Detective Comics, which technically speaking is the birth of DC Comics. That is why we have DC, because it comes from Detective Comics. And one of the main heroes of Detective Comics, as we see over here, was this initial creation of Batman. As we see, he was more of a detective who came out at night to solve mysteries and catch bad guys in reality. And obviously with time, that particular Batman, developed into something more sinister, something more psychologically deep, much darker, as can be seen, for example, from the last installment of the movie itself, where a lot of people are actually commenting on how sinister sort of the ambience is and the character is, and there is much more focus on the Batman rather than Bruce Wayne as a human being and as a character. The parallel of DC Comics was Action Comics, which was a derivative of Marvel. And these Action Comics, if you notice, were technically speaking, sort of comics which went off on their own, but ultimately amalgamated with Detective Comics, sorry, not Marvel, but Detective Comics, to become what we today know as DC. Right? So the Action Comics, as we see over here, and the first presentation of Superman as the hero which was saving the world from the current enemy, which were the Nazis of the era, the 30s, and the Batman, which was saving the cities of America from the mafia, from the bootleggers, and so on and so forth. So these came together to join into something that today is obviously making a very big noise. So because of Action Comics and the DC Comics, we see the advent of Marvel, although lately we've seen that Marvel has taken over very much the big screen when it comes to live action presentation of these comics. DC was much slower in taking up the challenge, but I believe that with Zack Snyder at the helm, they have managed to assimilate a lot of the experience of Marvel and be able to produce some very interesting productions, especially with the Justice League, as we've seen in the last rendition, in the last uncut version of Zack Snyder. I don't know if you have seen the Snyder uncut version. Anyone has seen the Snyder uncut version of Justice League? Anyone? No? Well, suffice to say, it's over 4 hours long. It's actually very interesting because it is a small screen, not a wide screen, because it was made for television actually. That's something that he wanted to incorporate, Zack Snyder. And it's the uncut version, because obviously it has been extended quite a lot, and what has technically been extended is the story of each and every character, and giving more life to the character, making them more real, giving them much more tangibility. And so once you see the uncut version, trust me, as opposed to the cinema version, it gives much more prominence to the characters and more makes them much more real. Definitely worth mentioning is The Amazing Spider-Man, which was one of the brilliant creations of Stan Lee. The Amazing Spider-Man was basically sketched on a napkin in a diner. When Stan Lee was asked to create a character which would appeal to the younger audiences, because there was this idea that comics were taking on a bit of a twist, and they were becoming much more adult in orientation. The amount of violence, perhaps, the what was being discussed in the comics, and so they needed something which would appeal again to the younger audience, to be able to obviously extend the consumers that would be interested in reading comics. Over here we have a brief video about Joe. Joe Sinnott, who's a penciler and inker, who worked very closely with Jack Kirby, a very famous individual when it comes to the Marvel Universe. So Joe was the penciler, while Jack Kirby was the inker. And then we have another character, Rob Steibel, who was the colorist, and together they managed to create a lot of comics from literally across states. So they never actually met physically, but they managed to create, for a span of years, if I'm mistaken, about over a decade, I think it was, they managed to create so many different comics. And this is a time where internet did not exist, and the only means of communication was the telephone. So we can see how important comics were at the day. Here we're talking about the 60s, and this importance actually managed to start creating this very efficient way of working across space and across time. The problem is that comics were becoming a bit too popular. And when something becomes popular, it starts scaring authorities because it would be seen as a threat. So what was later called as the dreaded Comic Code came into existence. Technically speaking, the American Parliament Congress decided to stamp down on a lot of the creativity of the day, because it considered it to be a bit over the top. It considered to be concerning with regards to how children were literally lapping up these media platforms, and their opinion was that what was currently being shown on TV, what was currently being said on radio, and also, yes, definitely, comic books were turning current children of the era, into juvenile delinquents, and they were obviously blaming comics and radio and TV with this respect. So their answer was to try to mitigate as much as possible the production of these entertainment sources, to curtail them, and to ensure that they did not have as expansive a reach as possible. The problem is that once something is successful and you try to remove it, that removing would obviously step on the toes of many individuals. So this particular comic code, as it was called, created a revolution. And usually that revolution starts with a resistance, and this resistance were the comic artists themselves, who started creating comics which were even more let's say over the top than what already existed. Now, this is a type of comic that was scaring the authorities. The fact that there was a very strong theme of horror, a strong theme of violence. These were elements that were not just popular, but they became so popular that again they launched live action series. Over here we have what was called the Haunt of Fear, number 14, being shown over here. It was a comic about, obviously, horror stories featuring the Old Witch, the Vault Keeper, and the Crypt Keeper. And this might resonate with some of you. I don't know exactly how old you are, but I remember a period of time when I was much younger, where they used to do, if I'm not mistaken, at 11 o'clock at night, they used to do the Crypt Keeper stories from the crypt, and you would have the Old Witch or the Crypt Keeper, which would start off the story, and then the film would start, the horror movie would start. This was done usually at 11 o'clock at night, but obviously that would be unreachable for some of the younger audiences. But when it was in the form of a comic, in the format of a comic, it was obviously much more reachable. And that was what was scaring the authorities, because they believed that these type of comics were actually destroying their youth. The answer was this. The answer was even more gore, even more violence, and, in my belief, some of the most important comics post-1970s. We have the creation of The Walking Dead, for example, which, as we know, until recently has been aired as a very successful series, and we have a lot of spin-offs being created also. I, Vampire is also very, very, very famous production by DC Comics, again, full of gore and violence and horror. And another production is Vampirella, which not only has a very strong presence of horror and violence, but also contains quite a strong presence of nudity. With regards to nudity, that was still curtailed to a certain extent in the United States, but in Europe, matters were different. In Europe, people seemed to have more of an open mind. Individuals seemed to be thinking more outside the box. So what was lacking in the US was definitely being replaced very efficiently in Europe. And we find the likes of, for example, Paolo Elleitieri Serpieri. I have some examples later on, but I might as well show you something from the internet. Paolo Elleitieri Serpieri is Italian. Elleitieri Serpieri, very unusual name, Serpieri. He's an Italian comic book writer, as we can see over here, and his comics include Druna, which can be said to be one of the most extra, how would you say, R-rated, one might say, comics that ever existed. We can see just, and this is sort of a sanctioned. Sort of, you know, there's very high nudity over it, and even it's not just the nudity, but it's also even the sexual content is quite high. I will not go into the images because the images are quite X-rated rather than R-rated, but you might want to have a look and see exactly what I'm referring to. So, technically speaking, what the comic code created was literally another monster. So the comic code was created to kill the monster, but that monster not only survived, but like the Hydra, every time a head was cut, another two replaced it. So it definitely did nothing to sort out things. In fact, we have the comic becoming even more wanted, even more liked, and the comic was being translated into film, live action film, more than ever. So automatically, because of this transition, we have the comic establishing itself as one of the most important visual elements that the art world has seen. The next part of this presentation, we're going to be discussing some important terms. I'm going to give you a brief explanation of each. I'm going to start with the annual, which is basically a comic which comes out once a year. Usually it would tackle a particular story, which would then be expounded upon by shorter comics throughout the year. These started in the 60s, and they became quite they never became popular as in being a collector's item, because they were very much standalone comics in the sense that they were the first hardback, so that was their main interest, because sort of they had a better presentation than the usual comics. But basically that was it, because sort of a comic which comes out once a year was not really something that a lot of people looked forward to. They needed the story to be more continuous. The arc would be a storyline that transcends one story, that transcends one timeline, but can actually go into different timelines. And a very good example would be Assassin's Creed. Here we have one of the comics of Assassin's Creed, and we see that in Assassin's Creed we see the character of the assassin, which is moving from different periods of time of the knights to the time of the Vikings, time sort of in the Egyptian times, and so on and so forth. So those would be different arcs. So a story that spans across more than one issue of a title, possibly includes more than one title. And then there would be the character arc, which literally is describing the journey of the character from point A to point Z. So the start of the journey of the character to the end of the journey of the character, and what happens in between. B&W Black and White. Black and White are comics which are actually drawn in black and white with some very, very, very mild presence of color. And this example over here comes from Sin City. Sin City was also made into 2 action movies. There are 7 installments of Sin City with regards to comics. Only 2 have been rendered as live action movies with an exorbitant cast, very interesting cast. Let's just have a look at Sin City. So this is the movie. We see the likes of, in one of them, Jessica Alba, Mickey Rourke, Rosario Dawson, Alex Bledel, Brittany Murphy, Quentin Tarantino, some big names, Elijah Wood, Bruce Willis, Benicio del Toro, Josh Hartnett, so Clive Owen, some really big names in cinema were actually present in both installments of Sin City. The first one is Sin City of 2005. A couple of years later, there was the second Sin City. And Sin City is also obviously originated as a Dark Horse comic series, and this would be sort of a typical comic book from Sin City. We see that there is a huge absence of color. Color is only present in very specific instances over here when we have the tale, for example, of the Yellow Bastard, which has been made into a live action movie. We see over here some presence of color to depict the dress of the female, for example, or blood in certain instances, but otherwise the whole comic is done absolutely in black and white. And it is interesting how it's in black and white, because it's not a simple black and white, because it's a more of a negative rendering of black and white, sort of the negative that we used to see in the old type of photography. This would be sort of Marv, one of the main characters of Sin City, as seen in the comic and in the form of Mickey Rourke over here. Mickey Rourke, who was sort of one of the quite a famous actor in his time, still quite a famous actor. Here we have the character of Bruce Willis, and so on and so forth. You have different characters as you see them in the film compared to how you see them in the comics themselves. And I believe this was a very good example of transmedia storytelling, sort of the way it was portrayed from comic to big screen. The balloon, it's not a bubble, it's not a speech bubble, but it's a speech balloon. And speech balloons obviously take different formats. This is the most typical format, which is the speech balloon, the normal one. And then you have the thought balloon, and then you have the shout balloon, for example, and then you have this, which is in the shape of a square, which would be usually the God's voice, we call it, which would be a voice which is not inside the story itself, but it's outside the story. Or it could also contain, for example, further descriptions to add more information to what is in the comic strip itself. After the balloon, another thing that I would like to say about balloons is the fact that these obviously have developed over time. There have been quite interesting variations of these balloons. For example, you might have something like this thought balloon with lines coming out, so that would mean that there's sort of something psychological. You might have a shout balloon, which would constitute of less, for example, less jagged edges, and so on and so forth. Sort of they were adaptations, but they would be derived from the more traditional, so automatically us as readers would immediately understand what is happening. Breaking the fourth wall. And sort of one of the most famous characters when it comes to breaking the fourth wall is what's he called? Madonna, not Daredevil.
Deadpool.
Deadpool, thank you. He's extremely well renowned for breaking the fourth wall. Breaking the fourth wall is when you stop referring to the individuals within the story itself, but you look straight into the camera or straight at the viewer, and you actually make reference to the viewer. You speak to the viewer. The character will speak to the viewer. So there's that breaking the fourth wall, something which in normal storytelling is a huge no-no, but in some cases this would have a very, I would say, beguiling effect or humoristic effect, and sometimes even a scary effect.
Yes, it was good how in the movie he mentioned like
Brilliant.
Green Lantern because it's the same actor.
Yes, exactly.
It's funny, yeah. It's like
Very, very, very.
you don't get it.
The more you know about the background, the more obviously it's going to make sense. In fact, this is himself, because obviously his role as Green Lantern was one of was a huge flop, and sort of everyone knows that the actor himself risked quite a lot in taking on the role of Deadpool, because there was a huge question marks in Hollywood about if it should be done or not, and he actually invested a lot of his private assets in the movie itself, and he did also a lot of the direction, he did a lot of the production itself. So he was really committed to its creation, and as most of us know, it was a huge success. Even the advertising, how it was advertised, it was originally advertised as a Valentine's Day movie. I don't know if you remember, if you're aware. Anyone? Deadpool film Valentine's movie ad. There we go. Ryan Reynolds, Morena Baccarin, Deadpool, True Love Never Dies, Valentine's Day. I Love You, Wade Wilson, Deadpool, Valentine's Day. It was actually advertised across the world as a Valentine's Day movie, and obviously this gave a good excuse to men to take their wives or their girlfriends or their sweethearts to watch this movie, and obviously we all know that it is anything but a Valentine's Day movie. Here we go. Babe, we have to go see this for Valentine's Day. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, you should check out the trailer. Okay. And I guess that would be the end of the conversation. All right, guys. So shows its success. So breaking the fourth wall is extremely intensive. It can't be misused. It needs to be extremely careful, the author, in using it. Here we see another example of breaking the fourth wall. Actually, here we see an example of what we think is breaking the fourth wall, but which actually is not breaking the fourth wall. So what we have is two characters over here, something that looks like a penguin and a bear. So Penguin is saying, Baxter, my cube was put back together wrong. What do you mean? It has no fourth wall. It's really very creepy. So he's referring to the fourth wall. Look, and actually look at the reader. Wow, that is creepy, right? And then you realize that they're actually looking at a window. And through the window, they can see this other character scratching his ass on the glass. So it must be a one-way glass. Of course, it might help if you weren't in front of the break room window. Okay, so we have the reference to breaking the fourth wall, indirect, subtle. Then we think it's breaking the fourth wall, but then realize it's not breaking the fourth wall. So that was a play upon breaking the fourth wall. Cameo appearances, very, 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 very popular, especially with Stan Lee in most of his movies, the movies that he helped to create. And here we have, for example, the appearance of Futurama in Simpsons. Here we have Superman versus Muhammad Ali. So these are comic cameos, and obviously we are more used to cinema cameos when for example, the director appears as one of the actors, as one of the characters. Alfred Hitchcock used to do that very much. Stanley used to do that. Peter Jackson did it in all 3 movies, actually. He appeared as a pirate in one, and as a soldier in another, and something else in the other movie. So it is quite a commonality, and it gives that kind of spice to the production, and this kind of tongue-in-cheek. The caption, these are the captions. This is the caption, this square over here. The caption is either used to explain what is going on, or else as a God's voice, as I said before. So here we have the X-Men, and we have Professor X over here, who is using these brain sort of projection. In fact, it's a thought bubble with these lines, as I explained before. And the caption itself is actually giving us more information. Finally, his meditation comes to an end. Then, while he remains completely motionless, a sharp, commanding thought rings out, echoing through the great halls of the building. So this is sort of a narrative going on, a random narrative. But over here, we have God's voice. This should be agony. I should be a mass of aching muscle, broken, spent, unable to move. And where I am, an older man, I surely would. And your question is Batman speaking, or is Batman thinking? Because they're using a caption, not a thought bubble. So what is it exactly? And then you realize that it is Batman thinking about sort of a past sequence. Okay, so captions are very specific. The cliffhanger, which would usually come at the end of the story and would leave us with a bit of question mark, meaning that we would be sort of, we wouldn't have what we call the denouement. The denouement would be sort of an explanation of what has happened at the end, a clarification, an understanding, a realization, one might say. So the cliffhanger leaves us questioning that and not understanding exactly, or waiting for a sequel, perhaps. Continuity, yes. One second, Alex, because I'm not getting everything that you're saying. You're sounding a bit muffled. Mm-hmm. Yes. 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 No. Oh, what do you mean?
For breaking the fourth wall, it's the same piece of text, and even for cameo.
One second. The storytelling technique, and even cliffhanger. All right, there must be. Oh no. Okay, something must have happened over here. Okay, I need to take care of this. Thank you guys for bringing my attention to it. Because usually I don't even look at the words. Obviously, I'm just okay. So it's cliffhanger, cameo, and breaking the fourth wall. No, you're perfectly was. So for character interacts with the audience, for breaking fourth wall, it's correct. So the ones which are wrong are cameo and cliffhanger. Those are the ones. In fact, what I'm going to do is this. So I will repopulate them with the relevant text. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. You definitely were paying attention. Cheers. My pleasure. Thank you, actually. All right, I'll take care of that later on. Continuity, the cumulative details about characters and settings in a shared universe, which can guide future story development. Now, continuity is a bit of a headache. Why? Because when characters started increasing, remember it's not the 60s, 70s, 80s, time is passing. In the 30s and 40s, we had half a dozen heroes, superheroes, but as time passed, the superheroes started becoming extremely numerous. And in fact, even today, we're seeing the creation of even more superheroes. We're seeing Netflix productions with superheroes which which sometimes are successful, sometimes are not successful. Sometimes we see superheroes that came and went just for one volume, like for example, one second, because sometimes I forget the The Watchmen. The Watchmen was a one-off installment. It's a comic novel, literally, and it was rendered also into a film, and that film was eventually also made into a series. I think they're in season 2, something like that. We'll be talking more about Watchmen later on. So the problem is that because we have all these characters being created by the same comic house, we might be tempted to start creating gray areas between the characters. Or what if characters start meeting? What is my Superman starts meeting Batman? Because obviously they're living in the same world roughly at the same time. What if my Batman over time is changing into other characters? We can see over here the different iterations of Batman. An old Batman, a young Batman, a young, I don't know, an android Batman, so many different types, an evil Batman, so many different types of possibilities. And what if my Batman had to meet your Thor? So we have DC and Marvel joining together. So we have all these possibilities, which are unlimited, really. Sort of, there's very little curtailing to this imagination. So what we need to do when we are creating these comics, we need to make sure that we leave some loopholes, which then in the future we might want to go back to, and we would explain those loopholes with the advent of another character, for example, or the intervention of another character, for example. And that is something that I'll be discussing also at a later stage. So continuity is something that you need to prepare yourself for. Now, the good thing about continuity is that when comic characters started to exist, these characters usually just appeared as a character, a fully grown character without a background. And when these characters, some of them started gaining popularity, then obviously the creators of the story needed to go back and create the storyline, the existence, sort of how did this character come into existence, where did he come from? So the backstory in reality. And when these artists, when these creators went back to the backstory, started creating the backstory, that is when they could start filling up these particular loopholes. Next in line, we have the debut. When we have a character who's already famous, for example, we have Batman over here, and we have the advent of Robin, the boy wonder. This is his first installation, the sensational character of Robin, and how he was produced, how he was presented to the audiences. So the first time appearance. And here we have the first time appearance of Wonder Woman in the movies, in the DC movies, as one of the Justice League in Zack Snyder's Uncut Version, and also her recalling to the comics and the screen after she had been absent since if I'm not mistaken, since the 80s. That was the last time that Wonder Woman was available on comics and on the silver screen. Dialogue comes in form of speech balloons, and dialogue can become a bit complex at times, depending on the complexity of the comic. And also it helps us to read the comic. Here we see that this is read, for example, in this way: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Because there is a distance between this, so we don't go 1, 2, 3 and then 4, 5, because it does not make sense. Although we do read left to right, so technically we should read 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But because this has been put further away from the rest of the balloons, then this is how it's read: 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 over there. Over here we have an interesting also presentation of the comic strip. We see that we have this strip has been divided into 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, but then we realize that it's actually the same screen over here, 1, 2, 3, and this is a different screen. So you have the same shot was divided into 3. So it's like having a conversation. He's speaking, camera goes on them, camera goes on them, then camera goes on another scene. So I have the same scene with 3 shots, and then we have a scene over here. And we see that there's a lot which has been taken up by the speech itself, but it's not really removing a lot from the content of the strip, for the simple reason that it's just filling the empty space which is at top. So there's a science of where to place this. This is ultimately what I wanted to say. There's a science of where to place the dialogue within comic strips. Flashback is another way of giving sort of part of the history of the character, history of the story, what has happened before. So it's a very important storytelling device. Another storytelling device which is related to flashback would be foreshadowing, which is basically placing either elements or saying things which are going to hint at the appearance or hint at the advent of another character, perhaps. And we see a lot of these foreshadowing happening in a lot of the movie productions of DC and Marvel. And also we see the advent of what we call the Easter egg. I don't know if any of you have an idea what the Easter egg is. Anyone can explain to the rest of the class?
Something hidden?
Yes, exactly, something that would be hidden and on discovery. So an Easter egg in a game would be something hidden that you can discover, that will give you more information, for example, or prizes, or it could give you a lead. But in a film, the Easter egg, because Easter eggs exist in films also, would give you that bit of a tidbit, technically speaking, which would indicate the existence of something that is about to come. So that would be sort of joining different productions together, or productions on the same linear production but at different times, and that would give them sort of a better correlation. Back to the 4-color process. We discussed the 4-color process when we were talking about the 4-color pulps, the process of printing comic books and graphic novels using the 3 primary colors, magenta, yellow, and cyan, plus black. That's why the 4-color process. Also visible in the evolution of film theory. In film, this also was very visible. If you look at old film which had been recolored, you would see that these were the 4 prominent colors, obviously black, then magenta, yellow, and cyan. Technically they're red, blue, and yellow. And the importance of the 4-color process was because they actually predetermined the main colors of superheroes. So superheroes were colored the way we see them today. For example, Superman is blue and red because of this coloring process, because that was the only color, those were the only available colors. And in fact, what we see is that even this color process actually gave creation of different characters in different time periods because of the availability of colors. So if we were to look at the slide, for example, we see there's blue and red, which were the most common colors. Then we have yellow and red, which were the second most popular colors. And then we have blue and yellow, which are the third most popular colors. But not just that. With the advent of the 4-color process, we started discussing the color theory. Now, color theory obviously is much more complex. And the color theory started off with comics, and because of the values that were being understood of each comic hero with regards to his or her character, because of the colors in the character, we also started developing meanings for colors which were assimilated by the advertising theory and marketing. And this is what I'm talking about. Let's have a look at this list. We have red over here, which means bold, energetic, passion, determination. Orange means enthusiasm, potential, heat, and humor. Yellow, attentive, safety, energy, and ostentatious. Green, nature, growth, safety, harmony, mysticism. Blue, depth, stability, wisdom, trust, and confidence. Purple, royalty, wisdom, hands off, and creativity. There's black, mystery, elegance, possible menace, and eternal. Notice that they are divided because these are not the usual colors that are used in comics. White, spacious, attendant, pure and sterile. Brown, grounded, earthy, dirty and gritty. Grey, ambiguous, smoky, mechanical and cold. And pink would be childhood, flesh and femininity. Now, one thing I need to talk about is the fact that sometimes we misconceive the meaning of colors. For example, in sales, we tend to use a lot of red, but technically speaking, red does not really attract people. Red actually stops people, because red is usually used as a warning. And actually, the colors that are usually used in sales, for example, if there's a sale in a clothes shop, something like that, are usually orange or yellow, because orange are yellow and yellow are colors which actually are a call for action. Okay. In fact, when you see orange, even in street lights, orange is telling you to do something. So it's either telling you to get ready to drive or to slow down and stop, whilst red is simply stop, sort of. It's there, so that means that everything is at a stop. So sometimes we have in time misunderstood, because we are not really intent about what are the actual meanings of colors. And for that purpose, what I have done, just in case you might be interested, if you go on Moodle, and you go on my page with regards to visual, today I have just uploaded a document over here, very interesting document called Star Color Theory. It's a book, quite a hefty book, with some very, very interesting insight with regards to color theory. So you are free to download that book, obviously. It is the ebook of an actual printed version. The printed version is quite expensive, so obviously this would give you, because I do believe in freeware and shareware, this would give you interesting access to color theory when it comes to marketing and so on and so forth. So we start getting the creation of these characters. So red and blue, which are technically, as we see over here, bold, energetic, passionate, determined, depth, stability, wisdom, trust, and confidence. We see these characters over here. Yellow and red, we see these characters, and yellow and blue, we see these characters. So we see the Flash, Human Torch, Plastic Man, Shazam, and Robin are all dynamic, light-hearted heroes. Over here we have the founding X-Men, were all in blue and yellow, like the police. Their blue uniforms convey that they are heroes, so they convey trust and confidence, which has the other blue traits of also depth and wisdom. So all these colors actually have much deeper meaning. Another element that is where discussion is inking and lettering. It was usually done in a very time-consuming way, as we see over here. Literal ink, Indian ink, and nibs, using pen and nibs. And first you would have the drawing in pencil, as we see over here. That would be inked painstakingly using actual ink. And these black areas would be painted using brushes and ink. But then obviously we have the advent of the digital, and the style changed radically. Sort of, and it does show that it's not anymore the older, much more painstaking version, but it would be the much quicker digital version of inking. Sensitive, for example, was inked entirely in the old-fashioned way. Also, what's the name of that comic? One second. Let me go to my shelves. Yes, Hellboy was also colored in that manner. We have V for Vendetta, which was colored in that manner. Watchmen, which was all constructed in that manner. And obviously then we have the much more older comics like Tintin, Asterix and Obelix, and so on and so forth. So many of the comics actually started in that way, but today, because we need to have faster production and more colorful and more adapted to the needs of today, all this has translated itself into a digital means. Okay. We have more examples over here of inking. This is the way a comic should be read. Notice leading one speech bubble leading to another speech bubble. So from there to there to there. Then again, you have to go left, to go down, and you go. And then over here we have all this. So this needs to be seen in an anti-clockwise, not a clockwise, anti-clockwise, and then we go to the end over there. Yeah, here you have inking. And then moving on to logo, even though logos have been adapted to modern times, we see that the logo can't be changed too much because obviously it needs to remain related to the old logo. So even though, for example, Batman has taken also this three-dimensionality, the Batman logo, yet it still retained a lot of the original. Superman also a lot of original, and Alice in Wonderland barely changed. All we have is a 3D rendering of it. The origin story, something that I already mentioned. The origin story would be going back and saying how, the character has come to life. So basically the story of Batman, let's say how Batman was created, because obviously his parents were killed, because he fell into a well and there were bets and all that. The story how Captain America was created, we saw it in the movie also, how he was a very thin man and he couldn't join the armed forces, and then he was made into the powerful man that we know today, and so on and so forth. The panel, very important. The panel are the boxes that are in each page. In comics, you can have a complex panel, you can have a much more simple panel. This panel is a comic on its own, standalone panel, where we'd see, for example, two. It's a very cute panel actually. We have two snowmen over here, and one of the snowmen with a flabbergasted expression is saying, "What the snow cone? You're sick," because obviously it looks like sort of that he's eating another snowman. Just a smile bringer, literally. We have a very interesting spread over here. Very interesting spread from Sin City, a spread that we've seen before, but again, I placed it over here because there's quite a lot to say. And then the spread, we see a whole page over here, and over here we see 6 panels. This has been placed in this way because obviously it's opened together, so we are seeing both at the same time, both this full page and these 6 panels. And what we notice is that the 6 panels over here are taking place at exactly the same time that the police are coming up the stairs over here. So basically what we're seeing are while the police are coming up the stairs, the time frame is exactly the same time that this guy is preparing himself and is taking sort of these pills to make him stronger, to be able to take on these police. And in fact, here we have open up police. So basically these police have arrived at the door. I'll be right out, and then you can imagine what happens next. So comics have managed in a very, very strong way to emulate cinema, the shots in cinema, the different, not just shots, but the different scenes in cinema, and how we can see sort of the camera moving from one aspect to another, and from one shot to another, and we immediately understand that they're happening at a consecutive time, or they're happening at the same time, or they're happening linear or vertical or horizontal, and this can be easily translated into a comic, and we easily understand that that is happening also in the comic and not just in cinema. We're seeing more spreads over here. Very interesting how this has been divided. Sort of the panels have been divided into fractured panels, and shows action, shows something being broken in a way. Again, we can see the visual elements, the visual element of indicating something visual, indicating an action, indicating the fact that there has been sort of something broken over here, even by the use of the panel themselves. Another wide spread over here with a background image, and then on the background image you have this collection of panels, then this collection of panels, then this collection of panels. So basically what we're saying is that these 3 fights are actually happening simultaneously at the same time, because they have been superimposed over that back image. Moving on to the plot. Usually the plot in storytelling includes 3 acts: the first act, second act, and the third act. Sometimes the second act is divided into 2. The first act would be introduction, placing the viewer into a context. The third act would be the conclusion. And the act 2, usually it would have either one panel or then 2 or more panels, but usually it's 2 panels, would be sort of the arriving to a peak and then sort of slowly going into denouement, what we call the denouement in the end. Then there would be the reboot. The reboot is when we take a character from the past and we reinvent the character to assimilate to more cultural and social developments. Over here we have a Superman who have been given longer hair, a more squarish face, a more muscled body, and so on and so forth. We have the retcon, where we go back. It stands for retroactive continuity. It goes back to in time. Remember when we were talking about those loopholes? And so the retcon is when you go back and fill up those loopholes and try to make things a bit more understandable. So basically retcons fill in the blanks between stories or attempt to smooth over contradictions between the appearance of a character. So over here, for example, we have an example of a Batman choosing cars, but we realize that those cars are not supposed to be there because they're actually cars from different period Batmans. We have cars from the 30s, cars from the 50s, cars from the 60s, and cars from the 80s, and cars from the noughties over here. The revival would be taking a character which has been killed off or died away because of lack of interest and reintroducing the character. We're seeing the reintroduction of the Flash over here and reintroduction of the Submariner over there. The script very much similar to the script of a play or the script of a movie, one might say. The difference is that what is usually seen as the action in the film will be a panel in the comic, and then there would be the caption, which would be actually what is being said. So the dialogue itself, and then the actual words. Academic word sequential art, which was coined by Will Eisner, who is one of the pillars of comics. In fact, he was also the creator of the Disney font, and he was very much one of the people who worked a lot with Disney. And he has quite a few, not just comics per se. He did a lot of comics, he wrote a lot of comics, but he wrote a lot of books on comics and what are comics really about. And he was one of the first individuals who actually presented the comic as something that had a very strong academic presence and not simply an entertainment one. Shared universe would be all the characters that are existing within the same universe, basically at the same time, perhaps in different countries. So there is the very big possibility that they would meet at one point in time, that would cross stories at one point in time. These are the different ages in sequential art. We have the golden ages, which are the oldest comics produced between the 38 and 45, silver age between 1956 and 1960s, and the bronze age between 70s and 80s. The current age has not been labeled as yet. Before we saw what we call a splash page, which is this one over here, that is also called a splash page. And the splash page would be 2 pages which are joined as one comic. And as we see over here, we have the background page, which has been superimposed by details of what's happening in that page. We also have the splash panel, which is literally one whole page used as one big panel. And obviously this gives that moment. This moment of salvation, perhaps. We're seeing that there's a fight happening over here again with the zigzag of panels, and then suddenly the Justice League comes and to save the day, and we see this beautiful, glorious moment being depicted as a splash panel. The superhero obviously is the good guy, and technically speaking, the superhero does not technically define good. The superhero is just the person who usually defends innocence. So the superhero can actually in himself be a mix between good and evil. In fact, we have good and evil in each of our superheroes. Definitely good and evil in Superman, in Batman, in Spider-Man, in Captain America, in many of these Marvel and DC comic heroes. Then there's the supervillain, which is the essence of evil, but it doesn't mean that the supervillain again is entirely evil, because as we saw in Thanos, for example, he actually reasoned out why he wanted to destroy a portion of the universe. Moving on to comic genre, different comics that we're going to go to talk about. So technically over here, I'm going to be speaking about different types of comics. So we're going to be talking about different names of comics, and I'm going to tell you sort of about European comics, American comics, and then we're going to move into manga. Shall we have a 5-minute break, guys, so I rest my voice, and then we come back and we talk about different comic genre?
Yes. Okay.
Sure.
Great. So we'll have a 5-minute break, go and make a coffee, and then we'll meet each other back here. Thank you.
Okay.
Great. Thanks.
Cheers. Hello again, guys. Welcome back. As I said, we'll be talking about some comic genre, some different types of comics, just to give you an idea of, we have quite a few that we need to talk about here. Bit of a long list, but obviously this will close this topic and give you a very good idea of different examples of comics which you can use in the exam itself. Okay, Alex, are you with us? Yes, thank you, Alex. Brigitte?
Yes, I'm here.
Super. Gavin?
I'm here as well.
Thank you, Jamie.
I'm here, sir.
All right, great. Thank you, Jamie. Maria?
Yes, me too.
Maria and Luke, last but not least.
I'm here, sir.
Thank you, Luke. So we're going to start with one of my favorites, which is Tintin. Tintin is quite an oldie, but goldie, definitely, created by Hergé. Tintin was this Belgian, French-Belgian character who had these adventures with his dog Milou, and they used to travel around the world. Literally, they went to the moon, under the sea. They literally went anywhere. And it has been revived in a way by Steven Spielberg with a movie which was created a few years ago. I think something over 10 years ago. It was a 3D movie, beautiful 3D movie. Let's see a couple of screenshots from the movie. Tintin movie. The 3D work on it is mind-blowing. It is extremely well done. Obviously, it's a Steven Spielberg movie, so we can see, no, this is not it. This is a live action. So this is the movie itself. You can see how effective, how real, and there's this sort of cameo of Tintin himself when Tintin is being drawn by someone in the plaza, and then he holds it up and we see the character of Tintin as a comic. So that is quite tongue-in-cheek. It is a very, very, very clean style of drawing, very linear with filling up of colors. There's very little shadowing. It's very straight to the point, very, very clean type of projection on the boards with regards to the paneling itself and the way dialogues happen. There's quite a few iterations of Tintin, and this here I introduced this particular image because this was one of the Tintin comics which was removed. In fact, it's not being produced anymore. It has been removed entirely because obviously of the racist indication, seeing that these black people were actually depicted very much in the colonial style rather than in what is acceptable today. The next one on our list is Asterix and Obelix. Asterix being the young dude, Obelix being the much thicker dude over here. Again, you can see the cleanliness. Again, it's a French production, Franco-Belgian, by Goscinny and Uderzo. It's very clean. Panels are very, very squarish. It's just slight difference in size depending on the content. Very tongue-in-cheek, quite funny, one might say. Very typical French. Moving on to something similar, again, you can see the enormous similarity. Again, this is French by Goscinny. Again, there's a mistake over here. Lucky Luke also was rendered in a film quite a few years ago. If I'm not mistaken, there was Terence Hill. So Lucky Luke film. Yep, here we go. This was the original film, and this was the more recent adaptation, UK adaptation of Lucky Luke, and this is the actual cartoon, because from a comic it went into a cartoon, from a cartoon it was made into this rendition, and it was quite an old one, and then there was the UK version of Lucky Luke. And the Dalton brothers, it's quite a sweet rendition, actually. And you can see the popularity. Obviously, these are the Dalton brothers over here. You can see the popularity of it because it has been re-rendered using transmedia so many different times. Here we have Druna by Eleutherius Sapir, which I mentioned before. I managed to find a couple of pages which absolutely have no nudity, which is very, 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 very rare with regards to Paolo Eleuterio Serpieri. He's Italian. And we can immediately see the different styling when it comes to Italian and French. So this would be oldish French, 70s, 80s. This would be 80s and 90s. Coto Maltese would be 80s and 90s. Again, it's an Italian comic. This would be Milo Manara, who was in Malta a few years ago. We can see the very eloquent and very smooth tones of French cartooning, French comics at the times. Moving on to Torpedo, which is Spanish by Enrico Sanchez Abuli. Again, quite clean, though in black and white, but quite clean and direct. Very different from the American comics that were being created. The Lindog, another Italian rendering by Tiziano Sclavi. Also quite clean, yet not so defined when it comes to the actual drawing. It's not so complex as, for example, we see in Torpedo, and then as we see in Milo Manara. These are more like paintings. Then we go to Mebius by Jean Giraud, also French, and we see that it's extremely artistic, extremely poignant. And then we go to Britain when we get the Dandy and the Beano, quite specifically British, very colorful, one-page comics or two-page comics at the most, not whole long, lengthy comic strips. Still existing today and quite old, started in the 60s and still going quite strong. There's the Beano over there, very colorful, aimed more at the younger audiences. Peanuts, also another classic. Peanuts is very much American by Schultz. Started in the 50s, ended in February 2000. Very much a tongue-in-cheek criticism of American society. Then we have one of my favorites again, Calvin and Hobbes, based on two philosophers, but depicting this boy and his imaginary friend who is actually a soft toy. And he actually gives life to a soft toy in his imagination. And this Calvin and Hobbes actually went on for quite a long while, between 1985 and 1995. It's also American and termed as the last great newspaper comic. So it was present in newspapers on a daily basis with a colored iteration on Sundays, and it used to explore different aspects of adult life from the viewpoint of a child. Moving on to another one of my favorites, Mouse. Mouse is also an American comic, which technically is a Jewish American by Art Spiegelman. Art Spiegelman decided to depict the experiences of a Polish Jew and a Holocaust survivor using animals similar to George Orwell and Animal Farm. And we see a lot of poignant metaphors over here, like the road over here, which resembles the swastika. And the characters were divided into three. We have the mice, which were the Jews. We have the cats, which were the Nazis, and the dogs and the pigs, which were the Americans and the British. Moving on to Persepolis, the two installments of Persepolis, an Iranian comic artist, Marianne Satrapi, who actually described her early adult years in Iran during and after the Islamic Revolution. So it's a very interesting tale because it obviously depicts in a format which is mitigated because it's a comic, but it obviously is tackling some very serious issues. The title is a reference to the ancient capital of the Persian Empire, Persepolis, and obviously it's talking about how Islam destroyed something which had been so beautiful in previous years. Another one of my favorites is Asterius Polyp. Asterius Polyp is a character, and it's depicted in a very interesting way, extremely interesting way, because as we see, sort of the comic is drawn in a very, very particular perspective. We see characters broken up into box art, or one might call it cubist art, and a character which would be sort of hazy, and then taking on more of a shape. This is the story of a man who's single and then meets a girl, they fall in love, they get married, and then the relationship breaks down. And the artist Mazzucchelli uses visual art to signify the build-up of a relationship and the breakdown of a relationship. It's a massive book, it's a massive story, it's very complex, and incidentally, David Mazzucchelli is one of the artists of Batman, a genius, if I might say. V for Vendetta, also an important iteration in comic history. We see here sort of an interesting take on the story of the attempt to explode Parliament by Alan Moore and David Lloyd, and these guys came up with the character of V. V was the guy who wanted to destroy Parliament, and in fact, it is in a futuristic London. And it was made into a film, also a very successful film with a couple of very strong actors. It was published by DC Comics, later on by Vertigo. And one might say it's a standalone. This is not a superhero per se, but although it was he was a superhero during the movie itself, and it actually speaks about the advent of oligarchies, and is quite skeptic in that regard. And one might say that it actually foretold the future, because as we can see today, the world has been taken over by oligarchies, and one might say that democracy is definitely different from what it originated as. Watchmen, again a standalone. It was a limited series originally, but then collected as one book, and it actually explores the lives, the private lives of these standalone heroes who are getting older. And we have very interesting aspects like rape, for example, because we have one of the heroes who actually raped another of the heroes, and had a baby, and this baby became a superhero, and she was looking for her father. We have all these little tales, and we have love stories which don't end up happily, and it's a very, very interesting comic book, which it's American also, and then it was made into a movie, a very good movie, because it was literally rendered panel by panel, very faithful according to the book. We might have a look at some screenshots from the Watchmen. So this is the film over here, notice, and this would be the comic itself. This would be the film. It's a very beautiful film. I strongly suggest that you watch it. These are the characters in the film. It's a very strong film, very, very, very interesting, and definitely this is the series. This is the series. No, sorry, these are sorry. It's Comic-Con. So these are guys dressed up as. This is the film. Very interesting. It's a beautiful rendition. I strongly suggest you guys actually have a watch. I don't know if you watched the film, but at least you might want to do that, because it's definitely something worth watching. Sin City, we've spoken already about Sin City, and the lack of colors, the black and white hues, and the negative, extremely violent, and very interesting use of panels, very interesting use of balloons, and a very interesting use of special effects. And again, made into a movie, very successful 2 movies. And then we come to manga, which is basically our last few slides. And this is where I'm going to stop, guys, because I don't want to go over my allotted time. Next time we'll start with manga. We'll be talking about manga. We'll be discovering some interesting manga, and then we'll have a look at some of my works in comic writing. I just tentatively tried some comic writing myself, because I believe that to really understand comics, you need to obviously go through the creative aspects of the medium. And then next time we'll also start our final topic, which is character creation, and that would be the end of our syllabus. Okay, guys. Any questions, comments, queries? Anything you'd like to add, perhaps?
Yes, thank you for the lecture. It's very interesting.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much for being present.
Thanks.
Thank you. And for the compliment. Anyone else?
I'm alright on my end. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys. Then I wish you a beautiful evening and bon appetit if you haven't eaten already. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.
Same to you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, guys. Have a good evening. Ciao, ciao.
Good evening. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.